Imagine being born into a world where nearly half of all children never saw their 5th birthday. No hospitals, no medicine, no safety, just hunger, disease, and constant danger. Every day was a fight to survive, and childhood as we know it barely existed. From tiny babies facing deadly infections to young children forced into labor at dawn, medieval life was a relentless test of endurance. In this story, we'll step back in time to explore the shocking reality of childhood in the Middle Ages, a world where play was a luxury and survival was everything. Stay with me because the story of these children is as heartbreaking as it is unbelievable. Imagine being born in a world where survival was never guaranteed. In medieval Europe, from the 5th to the 15th century, life began under a shadow of uncertainty. Childbirth itself was a dangerous ordeal for both mother and child. There were no hospitals, no advanced medicine, and very little understanding of hygiene. A midwife, often the most experienced woman in the village, was the one to deliver babies. She relied on tradition, prayers, and herbs rather than medical knowledge. Sometimes those remedies worked. Many times they didn't. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Historians estimate that nearly 1 out of every 3 babies died before reaching their 1st birthday. Diseases like dysentery, smallpox, and pneumonia had no cure. Even a simple fever could turn fatal. Clean water was scarce and milk spoiled quickly, so feeding newborns was risky. Many mothers, weakened by repeated pregnancies and poor nutrition, struggled to keep their babies alive. For families, the loss of a child was a grief they knew too well, but it was also something they almost expected. Childhood, as we think of it today, hardly existed. The medieval world was harsh and practical. A child was considered valuable not for innocence or joy, but for the work they could eventually provide. The moment a child survived infancy, life immediately tested their strength. Toddlers wandered near open hearth fires where burns were common. They played near animals that could kick or bite. There were no toys, no protected spaces, no safe homes with locks and fences. The village or manor yard was both playground and workplace, and danger was everywhere. Families often baptized babies within hours of birth, not just out of faith, but out of fear that the child might not live long enough to be given a Christian soul. The church reminded parents constantly, life was fragile, death was near, and salvation mattered more than survival. This shaped how parents thought of their children. Some were affectionate and nurturing, but others kept an emotional distance, perhaps as a way to protect themselves from heartbreak. Even for children who survived those early, perilous years, the path ahead was filled with struggle. Malnutrition weakened small bodies. Harsh winters froze little hands and feet. Poor sanitation spread disease from hut to hut. And yet, these children were expected to grow quickly into the roles their families needed: workers, helpers, apprentices. So, to be born in the Middle Ages was to be born into a gamble. A fragile life, weighed down by hunger, disease, and the looming shadow of death. But for those who did survive, childhood was not an age of play. It was an early introduction to the brutal reality of survival. If a child survived infancy, the challenges were far from over. The medieval world was unforgiving, and childhood was often brief. By the age of 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute to the household in some way. There was little time for play, and almost no sense of childhood as a protected stage of life. Instead, children were small adults in the eyes of their parents, expected to work, obey, and endure. For poor families, survival was a group effort. A young boy might herd sheep or help plow fields, while a girl fetched water, collected firewood, or cared for younger siblings. These tasks were not light chores. Carrying buckets of water from a stream could weigh nearly as much as the child. Feeding livestock meant braving the cold mornings or the muddy fields. Accidents were common. Children fell into rivers, were trampled by animals, or burned themselves while tending fires. Yet no one thought twice about giving them these responsibilities. Work was life, and every pair of hands mattered. Education was a rare luxury. In villages, most children never learned to read or write. Knowledge was passed down through stories, songs, and observation. A girl learned spinning and cooking by watching her mother. A boy learned farming by following his father. Only children of wealthier families, especially boys, were sent to monasteries or cathedral schools to be educated. For them, literacy opened the door to becoming priests, scribes, or clerks. For everyone else, survival skills were all that mattered. Nutrition was another constant struggle. Bread, pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, and occasionally cheese or salted meat made up the daily diet. Fresh fruit and meat were rare for peasants. Malnutrition left many children stunted, frail, and more vulnerable to disease. Winter was especially brutal. Food stores ran low, and families sometimes went days on little more than thin broth. Children often bore the brunt of hunger, as adults prioritized feeding those who worked the hardest. Clothing was simple and rough. A tunic of wool or linen, patched and repatched, often had to last for years. Shoes were a luxury, and many children went barefoot even in cold weather. Illnesses like pneumonia or the flux spread quickly, and without doctors or medicine, parents turned to folk remedies or prayers. Sometimes survival came down to luck. Despite these hardships, children did find moments of joy. They played with carved wooden toys, rag dolls, or even stones and sticks turned into games. Festivals brought music and laughter, offering brief escapes from routine labor. But these moments were short because the reality of medieval life always returned. Every day was a test of endurance. Childhood meant bending to the needs of family and community, growing up fast, and facing dangers that could strike at any time. It wasn't a question of if hardship would come, but when. And yet, those who endured carried with them a resilience that would shape their place in a world where survival was an achievement in itself. If hunger and hard labor didn't claim a medieval child, disease was always waiting. Illness was the silent predator of childhood, striking without warning and often without mercy. In an age with no antibiotics, no vaccines, and very little medical understanding, even the simplest sickness could spiral into death. Parents feared the cough of winter, the fever of summer, and the sores that spread across a child's skin, because any one of them could be fatal. Common childhood killers included measles, whooping cough, and scarlet fever, diseases that today are preventable or treatable. But in the medieval period, they swept through entire villages unchecked. Children were especially vulnerable because their bodies were weaker, often malnourished, and exposed to harsh conditions. A single outbreak could wipe out dozens of young lives within weeks, leaving behind grieving families who had little time to mourn before returning to the grind of survival. And then there were the plagues. The Black Death of the 14th century is the most infamous example, killing nearly half of Europe's population. Children with their frail immunity died in horrifying numbers. Accounts from that era describe villages where only a handful of adults remained to bury the countless small bodies. For a child, survival was not only about growing strong, but about avoiding the invisible killers carried by rats, fleas, and contaminated water. Medical care was primitive and often dangerous. Doctors were rare and expensive, and for most peasants, impossible to reach. Healing was left to herbalists, midwives, or wise women who relied on plants, charms, and prayers. Remedies included mixtures of honey and herbs for coughs, or strange practices like placing a live chicken on a child's skin to draw out illness. Some treatments helped, but many were useless, and a few were outright harmful. The church also played a role in healing. Parents brought sick children to holy relics or shrines, believing that faith could cure what medicine could not. Pilgrimages were made in hope that divine intervention might save a child. When death did come, families found comfort in the belief that their little one had entered heaven, free from the suffering of earth. But this constant presence of death shaped how childhood was understood. In many cases, parents avoided becoming too emotionally attached to their children until they reached a safer age, around 7 or 8, when survival odds improved. To us, this may seem cold, but for them it was a coping mechanism in a world where death was always near. Still, grief was real, and the loss of a child was deeply felt, even if it was tragically common. For medieval children, disease was not an occasional threat. It was a constant shadow. To live past childhood was to be lucky, strong, and blessed. Those who survived carried scars, not just on their bodies but in their memories, shaped by the brothers, sisters, and playmates who never made it through. By the time medieval children reached the age of 7 or 8, The world expected them to start contributing in earnest. Childhood as we understand it was almost over. For most, survival no longer depended solely on avoiding disease or hunger. It depended on work. Children became active participants in the household, the farm, or the workshop, often taking responsibilities that modern adults would find daunting. In peasant families, children worked alongside their parents from sunrise to sunset. Boys tended fields, herded animals, or helped with carpentry. Girls carried water, prepared meals, spun wool, and learned the skills they would need to manage their own households. There was little separation between play and work. Any games often mimicked adult labor, such as mini-farming or pretend cooking. Even chores were lessons, preparing children for the life they would soon inherit. Apprenticeships offered another path, especially in towns and cities. Around the age of 10, boys might be sent to learn a trade under a master craftsman. This could mean years of hard work for little reward, but it offered the chance to become a skilled artisan, something that could provide security in adulthood. For girls, formal apprenticeships were rare, but domestic work, embroidery, or helping in a merchant's household functioned as informal training. Both boys and girls learned early that survival depended on skill, obedience, and endurance. Education remained a privilege, largely limited to wealthier families. Boys of the elite attended schools attached to cathedrals or monasteries, learning to read, write, and study Latin. These children might dream of becoming priests, scholars, or clerks. But for most, education was practical and immediate. They learned to read the signs of weather, to identify edible plants, and to recognize dangers around the home. Life itself was their curriculum. Even play was influenced by the harsh realities of life. Festivals, fairs, and religious holidays provided rare moments of joy and relaxation. Children played games with sticks and stones, or ran through fields chasing one another, laughing in the sunlight. But these moments were fleeting. The adult world, with its labor, danger, and responsibility, was never far away. The line between childhood and adulthood blurred, and many children transitioned into adult roles long before their bodies and minds were ready. This early immersion into work and responsibility shaped the medieval child's worldview. Resilience, practicality, and endurance were valued far more than innocence or freedom. Childhood was less a time of leisure and more a preparation for survival. Those who endured carried a toughness born of necessity, a stark understanding of life and death, and skills that would define their place in society. The reality of growing up in the Middle Ages was unrelenting. Childhood was a fleeting phase, overshadowed by labor, disease, and the constant reminder that life was fragile. Those who survived carried the scars of experience, both physical and emotional, but also the knowledge that they had withstood challenges that could have easily ended their young lives. For those who survived the brutal trials of medieval childhood, adulthood brought both relief and new challenges. Life after childhood was not easy, but those early years, filled with labor, disease, and constant vigilance, shaped individuals in profound ways. The experiences of survival left lasting marks on the mind, body, and society. Physically, medieval adults were often shaped by their childhood hardships. Malnutrition and illness in early years left many shorter, frailer, or more susceptible to chronic ailments. Injuries sustained while working or playing in unsafe conditions could linger into adulthood. Yet those who survived also developed resilience. Their bodies were conditioned by years of labor and adversity, preparing them to endure the continued struggles of a medieval life. Mentally and emotionally, the impact was just as significant. Children who witnessed death, disease, and hardship from a young age often grew up with a heightened awareness of mortality. This gave rise to a society that treated life as precious but fragile. Religion played a central role in shaping the psyche of both children and adults. Parents and clergy emphasized salvation, morality, and the afterlife, reinforcing the idea that earthly suffering was inevitable, but spiritual rewards awaited those who endured. The harshness of childhood also influenced family and community dynamics. Families cherished children who survived, knowing the odds were stacked against them. Yet the constant presence of death meant that emotional bonds were often tempered by caution. Communities were tightly knit, as neighbors relied on one another to survive famine, disease, and war. Children grew up understanding the importance of cooperation and responsibility, lessons that stayed with them throughout life. For many, the skills and endurance developed in childhood became their greatest assets. Peasant children turned into capable farmers, apprentices into skilled artisans, and servants into trusted household members. The early lessons of work, observation, and survival gave them the tools to navigate a world that demanded constant vigilance. Childhood had not been a time of leisure. It had been a rigorous training ground for life, yet the shadow of their early years never fully lifted. Adults remembered lost siblings, childhood illnesses, and the fear that had accompanied each day. These memories shaped cultural attitudes toward children, parenting, and survival for generations. Medieval childhood was a story of fragility, resilience, and the human capacity to endure under extreme conditions. In the end, the story of medieval childhood is a reminder of how precious life is, and how starkly different it was in a time before medicine, education, and social safety nets. To survive those early years was to gain more than mere life. It was to inherit strength, endurance, and a deep understanding of what it meant to face the world head-on. Childhood, though harsh, forged the adults who would carry the society forward, shaping history one resilient generation at a time. And so the story of medieval childhood comes to an end, but its lessons linger. Life was harsh, fragile, and often heartbreaking. Yet the children who survived carried resilience, strength, and an unyielding will to endure. Their early struggles shaped not just their bodies, but the society they lived in, leaving a legacy of endurance and courage that echoes through history. If this story surprised or moved you, remember to like, share, and subscribe, because history has countless more stories waiting to be uncovered. And always, never take the safety and comfort of childhood for granted. It's a gift we often overlook.